Hello, so my name is Jake Saunders. I'm VP and Managing Director at ABI Research. I am a Brit. I used to live in Britain for a while. I'm actually now living in Singapore. I've been in Singapore now 19 years. I work for an American company. So I do apologize if I sort of mangled the English language. I'm all over the place. So being in Singapore, run the Singapore office. So ABI Research is a market research company. We're headquartered in New York. We've got a major office here in London. Like I said, I'm based in Singapore with a team of about 10 analysts, and I run a dedicated team looking at space tech. But to be honest, I'm not a pure space tech guy. When I was doing my master's thesis, I thought my future career would be in space tech. I had done my thesis on Iridium, Spaceway, and ICO, and as investment appraisal, had some interesting numbers. And in fact, my thesis came true. Two of the particular companies disappeared. Spaceway and ICO are no longer around. Iridium has continued. I'm glad to see them. In fact, I had the opportunity and privilege to meet Candace Johnson, who was very much involved with the early stages of Iridium, and see it evolve. But I've also been in the cellular world. So I've also been researching the evolution of 4G, 5G, I guess 2G, 3G. Now we're on the cusp of 6G. So I might sort of mesh those two different perspectives. So a very provocative title. It's probably a little bit overstated. Can satellite take on the terrestrial cellular market and win? I think maybe trying to get to the punchline, I think the answer is no, not in the short term, but perhaps in the long term, it could definitely get much more interesting, and certainly there's an opportunity for a complement to cellular. So where's the money? I remember this movie. Some of you might remember Jerry Maguire with Tom Cruise, and he's on his knees, and he's got his client saying, show me the money. Where's the money coming from? Fundamentally, right now, with satellite is very much coming from these four sectors: agriculture, construction, mining, and transportation, especially transportation. We've seen a lot of dependence on connectivity for maritime, especially the big ships, aviation as well, but we're seeing additional opportunities to expand into new sectors. In fact, we had done a project at the beginning of this year for the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Agency. I think they're still around. Hopefully they're still out. They might have turned the lights off this last couple of weeks. But they wanted us to look into solutions, capabilities, in terms of satellite to support near-shore ships and boats, in terms of supporting needs, in terms of tracking those particular, all the gear that goes into the sea, in terms of sort of clay pots and ensuring that sort of wildlife are kept safe and secure. So there's opportunities also expanding in other sectors. Some of you might have sort of sports watches, which might have cellular connectivity. Some of the very latest smart watches now even have sort of satellite IoT in them. So there's a number of expanding sectors, but these are the main ones. And really in terms of what's the business model behind it, it comes down to, are you looking for a very sort of power sensitive type application where you want that device to be able to last a very long time in the environment? Perhaps it's got to be 2 to 5. Some of the cellular devices can last easily up to 10 years in the environment, completely standalone on a battery. Or it might be looking for the lowest cost type scenario. Perhaps you're in agriculture, money is always very tight, and you want something which is very sort of low stream and minimize cost relating to licensing and so forth. Or you want that ability to lean into the hybrid. And this is what the cellular sector is really trying to sort of capture in terms of being able to sort of switch between terrestrial cellular and then satellite. So coming in out of my discussion, I'm going to be talking about sort of NTN, IoT, and also LoRa. So LoRa is long-range alliance in terms of that sector. So I'm going to be bringing that more into discussion, but these two sort of standards are competing against each other. So I think we're at a sort of crossroads of opportunity for satellite. I mean, historically, it's not been able to compete with the likes of sort of, sort of well, certainly not broadband, fiber optic, of course not. Even sort of in the 4G environment, 5G I think can support around sort of 20 gigabits per second, but we need a cell size around sort of 2 kilometers. If it's 4G, it can perhaps deliver around sort of 100 megabits per second, and it's sort of around sort of 6 to 10 sort of kilometers or so. There's Wi-Fi, which can go out to a sort of kilometer, but it's about 150 sort of kilobits per second. So there's been all sorts of solutions which sort of overlap and have limitations in their own rights. The satellite's always been able to provide guaranteed coverage. And as much as Elon Musk, on a particular video I've seen at a conference, he declared he can get Starlink signal inside a building. I think he was perhaps talking about a wooden American house where they don't have a lot of concrete, so not a rebarb, and maybe that's possible, but fundamentally it's got to be really coverage outdoors. But maybe he was talking about inside you have your Starlink antenna on the roof, you're using Wi-Fi inside the building, you go outside, and your service then switches over to the mobile satellite link, to the satellite link with Starlink. So there's some of the scenarios, we see some others playing in that space. But there's an opportunity, I think, for we can see in terms of what satellite on that sort of far end sort of dot there, see if I can get this to work, will move up on the sort of vertical axis. And a lot of, in terms of how do we sort of stimulate the opportunities for satellite I think a lot of it comes down to the launch systems. And this, we've been tracking the number of committed launches to date and also planned launches. And of course, it's not too surprising to see that the reds and then the pink, that represents SpaceX, so SpaceX, as well as also the Starship. Those launch systems are really going to transform the industry. And that's going to change the economics of service at total cost of ownership, which is one of the big equations when the bean counters at the mobile operators, at satellite operators, they're trying to work out what's the viable price points. This is going to change the equation where right now, it's about sort of $2,300 per kilogram in 2024. We anticipate that getting down to potentially around sort of $300 per kilogram when you get to sort of fully reusable SpaceX sort of Starship type sort of launch systems. And that really then starts to change the equation of the types of satellites you get in space and the volume. But I think there's going to be some challenges. There's a lot of constellations trying to get up there, but there's also some challenges, constraints, in terms of just being able to get access to those launch vehicles. Very busy slide. There's a lot going on. I think it reflects that reality where right now we've got SpaceX, we've got OneWeb, we've got Globalstar and Iridium. And then in progress, we've got to ramp up a number of different players from Europe in terms of Iris Squared. I think we heard mentioned already some of those Chinese outfits, so SpaceL, Tianfu, and then also sort of Guowang. They're getting very bullish. A number of other players, some Canadian. I think another key one clearly is Jeff Bezos, Project Kuiper. They're already starting to launch satellites into space as of this year. And they've got very aggressive plans getting to over 3,000 satellites in orbit. And they've got some very aggressive plans in terms of pricing. And then some additional functionality has been put in place in terms of software-defined capabilities, inter-satellite links in terms of optical and laser, also increase overall capacity and be able to route sort of traffic between the different satellites and so forth. That's going to change the equation and make the services much more versatile. Andy had a similar slide. I'm not going to really sort of dwell too much on the right-hand side. I think Andy did a great job of covering those different scenarios. I think what is quite interesting on the left-hand side is we've seen the ramp up from release 17 to 18, where we saw different types of topology. Release 19 has been very much sort of solidified this year. And we're seeing, instead of those sort of bent pipe type satellites, we're seeing satellites which have got sort of switching capability and essentially provide a full base station in orbit, which allows it to do full range routing. And that's really going to become a big game changer. Indeed, Iridium is leaning into that scenario. They've done a big pivot from being proprietary to being sort of very much standards-based. Clearly, they've got to get new satellites in orbit and so forth. And then get closer to 2030. But reality is, by 2027, release 20 of the 3GPP comes out, and the telco community are wanting to get a full integration of sort of satellite-type services with terrestrial satellites. And that's going to be interesting. I mean, themselves are a bit of a quandary. In fact, it came from a client event in Milan, and they're talking about sort of base stations and massive MIMO-type base station. These are sort of base stations with antennas with lots of transmit-receive type antennas capabilities. So we're going to offer a sort of not just 1 gigabit throughput, 2 gigabit throughputs, but also want to integrate sort of NTN into the service offerings and provide that to the customers, but also AI into the core, and be able to provide a sort of switching capability. So different strategies, different complementarities. I think what's quite important, you really just can't look at satellite IoT on its own. There are a few sort of CubeSat type operations, but I think especially we see, for example, with SpaceX's Starlink, they started off with VSAT terminals. They're targeting, obviously, residential homes, businesses, small homes type businesses, but also they're targeting mobile users. They've got relationships with T-Mobile using unmodified handsets. As Angie mentioned, yes, you can use unmodified. You can use the terrestrial cellular operators spectrum, and you can do it in a place like America. It's a big place surrounded by big oceans, much more tricky when you get to places through Europe, even into Asia, in terms of, therefore, that sort of mobile satellite spectrum or getting more secured access to spectrum will be quite key. But there's a number of different strategies you can see here. I think one to sort of pick up on is also AST Space Mobile. They don't have quite the same aspirations for a number of satellites in space, but one of their key strategies is to make sure there's a very large antenna array. I think the current sort of cluster supports antenna arrays which are, I think, 64 square meters. The next generation are going to be 224 square meters. So those are big antenna arrays, which therefore improves the link budget between the satellite in space and the ground. Quite clearly, Starlink are really ramping up their satellites. We should have just checked the latest count. I think they're certainly past 7,000. I think they're aspiring to at least 15,000. I think even have bigger numbers, even 40,000. And that could really change the economics of capacity, which could be a big driver here. On the right-hand side, we've got a couple of charts we have. So we've got the broadband, which is the blue. And then we've got, on the green, we've got NTN Mobile. By 2030, it's a little bit under 100 million. We define that as people actually reaching into the wallet, pulling out money, and paying for actual usage. There could easily be another sort of 300, 400 million users who just have access to satellite NTN Mobile services in the case of emergency. How do you count them? But maybe they start dipping into these services. Certainly some of these plans, if you're on a premium plan, you essentially get access to it, but it really requires this sort of whole spectrum of services being offered to make satellite IoT viable, because satellite IoT, there may be a higher volume of devices, but the sort of the ARPU per unit is much lower. And that comes down to sort of the next couple of slides. So we're seeing a ramp up. So in 2024, a little bit under 9 million IoT connections that are on satellites. We see that ramping up by 2032, it's a little bit over 35 million. And a big sort of contest between sort of NTN IoT and NTN LoRa, NTN IoT and NTN NR, which is the more 5G compliant version, and then LoRa, which is the long range alliance. And they have, I think it's around an installed base, around sort of 350 million IoT devices. Those are all terrestrial devices, but they also have aspirations to get into space. So in terms of EchoStar Mobile, Lacuna, Plan S, Eutelsat, FOSSA, they're much backing LoRa. In terms of the sort of 3GPP initiatives, we've seen some clear support from Satellite, Iridium, Skylo, so a number of key players there. But we see some challenges. Again, Andy mentioned, I think in terms of that uplink, there was around sort of 2 megabits per second. So there are some challenges there. But I think we see some interesting sort of developments taking place. In terms of the competition, it's a rapidly moving sector. Apologies, this particular snapshot represents event of 2023. We're right now sort of doing an assessment of over the end of 2024. Should have that sort of data out in the next few weeks. But what we're sort of seeing is a big sort of dynamic change where, we saw that merger between Viasat and Inmarsat. We've got Iridium. They're all been sort of showing strong growth numbers in terms of number of satellite connections. I think the big item to focus on is in terms of these new sort of players, whereas sort of like SpaceX, they've got very much a game plan to get into the satellite space, and then SpaceCell and Geely. So Geely is an Chinese automotive company. I think they've got about sort of 14 satellites, but they want to expand that sort of constellation. And again, in terms of the automotive market, we're seeing shifts there. Until just almost a year or so ago, we have analysts within ABI Research who are dedicated to the automotive market. And of course, we're all pretty much in a car which is connected. And a lot of those, you have a telematic control unit embedded in your car. It's providing perhaps connectivity to the end user, perhaps entertainment to the people in the passenger seat. But it's also picking up telemetry from the engine, the brake pads, and the car vendors. They want to get that information. It's valuable for them to see if there's any sort of major problems they're experiencing across some of the new perhaps some of the cars they got in the marketplace. But they've always said, no, we're just happy to get that telemetry at the end of the day once you get back into cellular coverage, perhaps once the car is parked back in the garage at home or under the apartment block and so forth. But they're starting to see a shift, and we're starting to see telematic control unit vendors want to plug into satellite. So we'll see a shift in that space. So the economics, I think, is one that's really going to start to shift. So, we've got LEOs, obviously geostationary. You can see a big aspect of the Earth. LEO is much lower latency. LEO is supporting between sort of lower latencies of between 30 milliseconds and 50 milliseconds. Yes, they zip overhead and so forth. In terms of a LEO terminal, in terms of its power consumption, it's around sort of a little bit under 0.4 watts, whereas the geostationary is about a watt. So there's those type of characteristics. But then what really starting to shift is the dynamics between the incumbent sort of satellite IoT players and the new players. And so I think, we look at, we're seeing a real impact in terms of the tariff plans and the connectivity rates. We see a projection we're going to see a decline at least around a little bit under 5% year on year over the next 5 years. And my sort of third bullet point, I sort of really hesitate sort of putting that. I wanted to provide that sort of perspective. 1 megabit. Relative, most IoT does not need a megabit. Most satellite IoT is sort of sipping or transmitting a few, even sometimes a few bytes, or perhaps tens of bytes, or hundreds of bytes, or kilobytes. But I just want to try and sort of put that in context when you look at some of the latest satellite operators, how they're trying to get the cost per bit down, where you can definitely see if you sort of calibrate that, saying, well, okay, well, to send 1 megabyte, what would that cost in terms of connectivity? It can range from sort of $4,000 down to $0.001. And that is really going to change things, where you've got perhaps a monthly plan, where you've got a series, perhaps tens to hundreds or thousands of IoT devices. There's a lot of sort of pricing dynamics and fluidity there. But we're going to have to see that complete flush through, where there's going to be a big change over the next few years, whereas some of the more incumbent type satellite operators, they'll need to drop their connectivity to a much lower level and also have the ability to support greater throughputs. But there's been a big sort of flux and change we're seeing in the marketplace. So, interesting dynamic. Really, to be fair to this slide, I should have a third one, which is the proprietary systems. There's a number of satellite operators providing, they've got dedicated relationships with customers. They're using proprietary terminals, and they're doing very well. They've got a healthy financial model, but they're going to be impacted by a number of aggressive players from SES, Viasat, and so forth, where we see using these standards, LoRa, and 3GP in terms of NTN IoT and NTN NR to really try and sort of get some scale and volumes, and the competition of the two. Certainly with LoRa, they've got a very large device ecosystem, a lot of relationships in place with device manufacturers, so they have that in their camp. But over the longer term, we sort of feel that 3GP is very much likely to win out. We see that momentum build up behind NTN IoT, and over the longer term, NTN NR. And that's really going to sort of change and make the marketplace really evolve. With this slide, I needed to make sure we also bring in some other dimensions here. If anything, I can't have a presentation without mentioning the word artificial intelligence. And again, this will have some seismic impacts on the marketplace. There is a lot of interest from a number of satellite providers to put edge capabilities in terms of putting sort of edge compute into space, where it perhaps could be analyzing, Earth observation, looking at imaging, is that IoT? Perhaps not, but there's remote sensing, which is part of the equation. But in terms of doing analytics, it's going to be a big sort of momentum here. And there's a few different facets. So one is analyzing data, use that advantage for more strategic type decision making. but also just managing the networks. I think we're seeing, especially we move into the 6G world, where you've got to have a signal, and perhaps someone is walking down a street or in the countryside, but then they need to move from the cellular network to the satellite network in terms of that routing. So in terms of the operation support systems, even the business support system, OSS and BSS, this is a big thing in the terrestrial cellular world. We've got to better route that user and seamlessly route the traffic then to the satellite network or off it. It's going to be that will drive a lot of investments in the sector. So in terms of integration, not just simply of IoT into the network, but also artificial intelligence and edge capability to analyze that data. So to wrap up, right now, satellite IoT cannot take on terrestrial, but I think we'll see some surprises over the next 5 to 10 years. Certainly, satellite IoT provides universal coverage. That's always there. Perhaps it's not just simply to maritime vessels and aviation, not just simply sort of trucks and so forth, but to all cars. Your passenger vehicle, where, like myself, after this particular stint here in London, I'm going up to Norfolk, I'm going to see my mother. She lives in a place called Holt, and I can tell you there are parts of that countryside where there's still not even 4G coverage. And that, to be honest, is a travesty, and I think that needs to change. And I think that therefore, in terms of how to integrate satellite, NTN, IoT, NTNR, into the experience for the end user is truly profound. I think another one, before COVID, I had an opportunity with my brothers to go up to Scotland. We went to Neudark. I don't know, many people here know where Neudark is. Basically the end of the line goes to Malig. There's a lock there. On the north side of that lock, there is no cellular coverage whatsoever. So even in Britain, you can find places where there's no coverage whatsoever. And I could say the whole day, it was raining, it was getting close to autumn, but we didn't see another human being, and therefore having reassurance of coverage, I would pay for that. I'm sure there'll be many people who do. But I think in some of the challenges, I think there's still a need to sort of who do you partner with, who do you build strategic relationships. There's a tremendous amount of capacity already in place. There's going to be more capacity go into place in terms of having sort of blended business strategies where you need broadband, you need also NTN mobile, and IoT is going to be part of the equation. I could even see some of our forecasts being revised up. Forecasting is always a challenging business. You kind of got to get it right. You can't be too aggressive, you can't be too conservative, but a forecast reflects a certain balance of realities right now, but it could see things change and evolve rapidly as we see the likes of Elon Musk's Starlink system really ramp up its coverage and target the satellite IoT space. So a lot of sort of marketing efforts and consumer outreach will be needed, but getting to the punchline of my presentation, in the short term, satellite will very much be a complement to cellular, but in the very long term, we could see some surprises. I think it's also fascinating, I actually didn't mention it, but at the beginning of the year, Apple announced a sort of patent filing. Apple has a relationship with Globalstar. Globalstar is a LEO system, but Apple's patents, maybe they're trying to plug themselves into other areas and try and get royalties, but they put this patent in for a multi-orbit system in order to route the telemetry and data from different types of constellations, not just LEOs, MEOs, but also GEOs. So I think we can see some perhaps potential interoperability between different networks coming into play. Some of the signals that are coming from the ground, they go past the LEOs, they go to the MEOs. That could again be an opportunity for further harvesting information. So it's an exciting space and one that's changing at a rapid rate. Thank you.